She walked into a dead town with nothing but a worn bag and a letter. And inside that house waited 2 starving children, a broken man, and a secret that had been slowly killing them all. The drought had taken everything from Red Hollow. The crops, the money, the will to keep going. But the thing nobody talks about, the thing that truly destroys a family, isn't hunger. It's silence. Marianne Voss was about to walk into the loudest silence she'd ever heard. If this story moves you, drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this has traveled. Hit like, and stay with me until the very end. The train didn't slow down the way it was supposed to. It lurched, a grinding mechanical protest, and the passengers grabbed whatever was closest to them. A woman in the back car reached for the overhead rail and missed. A traveling salesman with a leather case braced his feet against the seat in front. A child somewhere up ahead started crying. Marianne Voss grabbed the edge of the wooden bench with both hands and held on. When the train finally groaned to a stop, the conductor walked the aisle with a lantern swinging from 2 fingers, looking mildly inconvenienced rather than apologetic. "Red Hollow," he announced, in the flat tone of a man reading off a list of things he didn't particularly care about. 15-minute stop. Marianne was already on her feet. She pulled her canvas bag from under the bench, the kind of bag that had been restitched so many times the patches had their own patches, and made her way to the door before anyone else had even uncrossed their legs. She stepped down onto the platform, and the heat hit her like something solid. It was the kind of heat that didn't just sit on your skin. It pressed. It sat behind your eyes and made you feel like you were breathing air that had already been used up by someone else. She stood there for a moment, bag at her feet, and looked at Red Hollow. It wasn't the smallest town she'd ever seen, but it was close. The main street ran maybe 300 yards from the depot to a water tower that looked like it hadn't held water in weeks. A general store, a livery stable with one of its doors hanging at an angle, a church with sun-bleached wood, a saloon where 2 men sat on the porch without speaking, watching her the way men in dead towns watch strangers, without much energy and without much welcome. The dirt on the street was the particular pale gray color of earth that had given up. No mud, no tire ruts softened by rain, just hard, cracked ground with thin splits running through it like old skin. Marianne picked up her bag. She already knew what a dying town looked like. She'd left one behind in Ohio 3 years ago, and another one after that in Missouri. She'd gotten good at reading places the way other people read faces. The slump of a building, the emptiness of a storefront, the way the air itself seemed to hold its breath. Red Hollow was in trouble. She walked toward the general store because that was always the place to start. The bell above the door was the broken kind. It made a sound, but barely. The man behind the counter was somewhere in his 60s, sun-dark and wire-thin, with a white mustache that did most of the expressing on his face. He looked up when she entered, took her in with 2 seconds of silent appraisal, and seemed to arrive at something. "Help you?" "I'm looking for the Hart Ranch," Marianne said. "Can you point me in the right direction?" The mustache shifted. Something moved across the man's face that wasn't quite an expression. "Hart Ranch," he repeated. "Yes, sir." He set down the ledger he'd been pretending to write in. "You family?" "No." "Friend of Gideon's?" "No, I answered a notice." She shifted the bag on her shoulder. "He was looking for a housekeeper." There was a pause. Not the polite kind, the thinking kind, the kind where a man is deciding how much to say and settling on less than he probably should. "Ranch is about 2 miles east," he finally said. "Follow the main road out of town. Look for the Split Oak. Lane runs south from there." He paused again. "You got a horse?" "No." 2 miles in this heat's a fair walk." "I've walked further." He looked at her for another moment. Then he nodded once and picked his ledger back up. But he called after her before she reached the door. "Miss?" She turned. "His name's Gideon," the old man said. "The man at the ranch. He ain't—" He stopped, pressed his lips together, started again. "He's had a hard year." Marianne waited to see if there was more. There wasn't. "Thank you," she said, and went back out into the heat. She found the Split Oak. She found the lane, and she walked the last half mile with her boots raising small clouds of pale dust that settled almost immediately, like the air was too tired to carry them. The ranch came into view gradually. First the fence line, then the roof, then the whole of it spreading out from a low rise in the land. It wasn't the worst thing she'd ever seen, but it wasn't far off. The main house was a two-story structure built from timber that had once been painted white, though the paint had peeled back in long strips that gave the walls a scabbed look. One of the shutters on the upper floor was missing. The porch steps had a gap on the right side where a board had gone through and nobody had replaced it. The yard between the house and the barn was not so much a yard as an accumulation. Rusted tools, a broken wheel half buried in dust, what looked like a child's boot sitting by itself near the fence post. One boot? Marianne looked at it and then looked away. The barn was in better shape than the house, which told her something about the man inside. He was still maintaining what mattered to the animals. Everything else had gone sideways. She climbed the porch steps, left side only, avoiding the gap, and knocked. Nothing. She knocked again, louder. Somewhere inside the house, something scraped across the floor. Then silence. Then the door opened. Gideon Hart was not what she expected. She hadn't built much of a picture from his letter. It had been brief, almost curt, the kind of writing that came from someone who chose words the way a man chose rations, carefully and without waste. Housekeeper needed. 2 children. Ranch work. Room and board provided. Respond with experience and references. That was it. No name at the bottom, just an initial, no pleasantries, no indication of how desperate the situation was. The man standing in the doorway was somewhere in his mid-30s, maybe a year or 2 older than her. He was tall and lean in the way that comes from work rather than nature, with dark hair that hadn't been properly cut in months, and a jaw that was past stubble and not quite a beard. He had the kind of face that might have been described as handsome once, in the way a knife might be described as elegant, clean lines, hard angles, built for function rather than admiration. He looked at her with eyes that were gray and flat and extremely tired. "Miss Voss," he said. It wasn't a question. "Mr. Hart." She held out her hand. He shook it. His grip was firm but brief, like a transaction. "You're earlier than I thought," he said. "Train was on time." She paused. "I wasn't sure it would be." He looked past her at the yard, as if checking whether she'd arrived alone, then stepped back and opened the door wider. "Come in." The inside of the house smelled like wood dust and something else, something Marianne recognized from other houses in other hard places. It was the smell of meals not cooked, of rooms not aired out, of days passing without anything being cleaned or opened or lit. It was the smell of a household that had stopped trying. She stood in the front room and took it in quietly, not making a show of it. The furniture was solid and had been quality once. A table, 4 chairs, a sideboard against the wall with some dishes still stacked on it. A braided rug on the floor that had been beautiful and was now worn thin at the center. On the mantel above the fireplace, 2 photographs in oval frames. A woman with a direct gaze and one hand resting on the arm of a chair. She didn't look at the photographs for long. "The children," she said. Gideon Hart glanced toward the staircase. "They're upstairs." "How old?" "Claire's 11, Ben's 6. "When's the last time they ate a proper meal?" A long pause. "Today I gave them." He stopped, seemed to reconsider. "Yesterday there was bread, dried beans the day before." Marianne set her bag down by the door. "Where's your kitchen?" "What?" "The kitchen, Mr. Hart. Where is it?" He stared at her for a moment like she'd asked a question in a foreign language. Then he seemed to remember where he was. "Through there." He gestured past the staircase. She went through there. The kitchen was bad. Not dangerous, not filthy. Just stripped down to almost nothing, the way a room looks when it's been used up without being resupplied. There was a wood stove, cold. A water pump over a low sink. A small table. One shelf with maybe a half-dozen items on it. A near-empty sack of cornmeal, some dried beans, 2 jars of something pickled that she didn't try to identify immediately, a tin of salt, and a handful of dried onions hanging from a string near the window. She stood in front of the shelf and looked at it for a long moment. Behind her, Gideon had followed her to the kitchen doorway and stopped there. She could feel him watching her. "I know it's not much," he said. Flat. No apology in it, just fact. "It's enough," she said. She pulled her sleeves up and got to work. The first problem was the stove. Someone, she suspected Gideon, had let the ash build up too long, and the draft wasn't drawing properly. She cleaned it out methodically, carrying the ash pan to the door and emptying it in the yard, twice. Then she rebuilt the fire from the wood stacked on the porch. At least there was wood, that was something, and got it going with the patience of someone who had built 1,000 fires in bad conditions and knew that rushing it only made it worse. While the stove warmed up, she took proper stock. The cornmeal was workable. The dried onions were in better shape than they looked. She found, on a second look, 3 eggs in a tin box near the back door and a small crock of lard covered with cloth. She found a partial jar of molasses in the back of a cabinet, almost crystallized. She found a tin pot and a cast iron skillet that had been left unwashed, and she washed them. She made cornbread. It was the most basic thing she knew, and it was exactly the right thing. It used what was there. It fed people, and the smell of it cooking was something no house full of hungry children could remain indifferent to. She made a pot of beans with the dried onion and salt. It would take longer. Beans always did. But she put them on to soak while the cornbread went into the stove. She heard Gideon moving somewhere in the house. She heard, after about 20 minutes, the sound of small feet on the stairs. She didn't turn around. Chesed. The younger one came into the kitchen first. She knew it without looking because of the way the movement sounded. Quick, light, the way small children moved when they were curious but still trying to look like they weren't. She kept her back to the doorway and worked on the beans. "It smells," said a small voice. "It does," she agreed. A pause. "Like food," the voice added, as if this needed clarifying. "Cornbread," she said. "About 20 minutes yet." She heard him come closer. She turned around then, slowly enough not to startle him. Ben Hart was small, even for 6, thin in a way that made her stomach tighten, with a round face that still had the softness of young children and eyes that were very dark and very serious. He was wearing a shirt too big for him that had been patched at the elbow. His feet were bare. He looked at her with the frank, unselfconscious assessment that children did before they learned it was rude. "You're the new lady," he said. "I'm Marianne." "Marianne," he repeated, trying it out. "Are you staying?" "For now," she said. "Are you hungry, Ben?" He looked surprised that she knew his name. Then he nodded, with the whole-body commitment that hungry children had. "Sit down, then," she said, nodding toward the table. "Not long now." Clara took longer. The cornbread was out of the stove and cooling on the shelf, and Ben was sitting at the table with his hands folded in his lap, waiting with the careful discipline of a child who'd been told too many times that patience was necessary, when Marianne heard the second set of footsteps on the stairs. These ones were slower, deliberate. Clara Hart appeared in the kitchen doorway and stopped there. She was tall for 11, all sharp elbows and coltish limbs, with her father's gray eyes and her mother's, presumably, thick dark hair pulled back in a braid that someone had done days ago and not redone since. She was wearing a dress that had been hemmed unevenly, the kind of hemming done by someone who was trying their best and knew they were getting it wrong. She looked at Marianne with those gray eyes, and something in them was very careful and very controlled, and also, beneath all of that, absolutely exhausted. "Papa said you came," Clara said. "I did," Marianne said. She didn't smile. She'd learned with older children that smiling too quickly came across as performance. "Who said you could cook in our kitchen?" "Your father showed me where it was." Clara's jaw shifted. She looked at her brother sitting at the table and then back at Marianne. "He doesn't eat much anymore," Clara said, meaning, clearly, Gideon, in case you thought he was going to sit down with us like everything is normal. The matter-of-fact way she said it, the 11-year-old weariness of it, hit Marianne somewhere square in the chest. "Sit down, Clara," she said. Not unkindly, just plainly. Clara looked at her for a long moment. Then she came into the kitchen, pulled out a chair, and sat down. She sat very straight, with her hands in her lap, and she didn't look at the cornbread. Marianne cut the cornbread and put it on the table. Ben reached for it immediately. Clara didn't move. Marianne sat down across from them and took a piece for herself and ate it. Ben ate. Clara sat. The beans weren't ready. They'd have those later. But after maybe 5 minutes, when Marianne had eaten her piece and poured water for the two of them and was making no great show of watching Clara, the older girl reached out with one hand and took a piece. She didn't look at Marianne when she did it. She just ate. Gideon didn't come to dinner. Marianne hadn't really expected him to. She put a plate on the sideboard, covered it with a cloth to keep the flies off, and said nothing about it to the children. After the meal, she washed the dishes with Ben trailing after her, asking questions in the relentless way that 6-year-olds did. Where are you from? Do you have a horse? Is Kansas your favorite state? Can you whistle? What's your favorite color? And she answered all of them in the patient, unhurried way she'd learned from years of being around children who needed to feel heard without being made a fuss of. Clara disappeared upstairs. Later, when the house was quiet and the light had gone long and amber across the kitchen floor, Marianne went looking for Gideon. She found him in the barn. But he was sitting on a hay bale near the end of the stall row, not doing anything she could identify. Not working, not resting. Just sitting with his arms on his knees and his eyes on the middle distance, in the way she'd seen men sit when they'd run out of things to do and didn't know how to just stop doing. He looked up when she came in. "Children eat?" he asked. Both of them. Something moved through his face. It was hard to name, relief and something else underneath it, something that looked almost like it hurt. Clara usually doesn't. She ate, Marianne said. She found an upturned crate and sat on it. The barn smelled like animals and hay and old wood. It was a not unpleasant smell. "You had food for the animals," she said. Not an accusation, just an observation. "They don't eat cornmeal," he said. "No." She was quiet for a moment. "How long since she died?" The directness of it seemed to catch him sideways. He looked at her with those flat gray eyes, and for a moment she thought he was going to tell her it wasn't her business. "March," he said finally. 6 months ago." "What was her name?" Another pause. Like even saying it cost something. "Ruth." Marianne nodded. Outside, something moved in the dark. Probably a dog or a raccoon near the fence. The lamp she'd brought cast a soft circle of light that didn't reach the rafters. The notice said housekeeper, Gideon said, and his voice had taken on an edge, not hostile, but guarded. "I hired you to clean and cook, not to ask questions." "I know," she said. "Then why?" "Because I want to understand what I'm walking into," she said plainly. "Not to pry. Not because I don't have enough work to do. But because if I'm going to be in that house with those 2 children, I need to understand what kind of shape things are in." Gideon looked at her. The edge didn't quite leave his voice, but it shifted. "Now you know," he said. "Some of it," she said. She stood up, picking up the lamp. "There's a plate for you on the sideboard, cornbread and beans." She moved toward the barn door. "It's better warm." She didn't wait to see if he moved. He ate the plate. She found it in the kitchen the next morning, empty and rinsed, sitting by the pump. She noted it and said nothing. Bussin. The days that followed had a strange quality to them. The slow, cautious rhythm of people learning how to be in a space together without crowding each other. Marianne got up before dawn. She'd always been an early riser, trained by necessity rather than preference. There was always something that needed doing before the rest of the world caught up. She rebuilt the fire, started whatever she could with what she had, and by the time the light changed outside the kitchen window, from black to gray to the washed-out gold of early summer morning, she'd usually gotten an hour of solid work done. The supplies were a persistent problem. She made an inventory on the 3rd day, a careful, written list, and it told a story that wasn't good. The household had been running on near nothing for weeks. Not quite starvation, but close enough to see it from there. She had enough for maybe another 10 days if she was strategic about it. After that, there would need to be money. She folded the list and put it in her apron pocket and waited. Gideon was not a man who came to people. He was a man who worked near them, if he was going to be around them at all. She saw him each morning going out to the animals. She saw him each evening coming back from the fields, slower than he'd gone out. The particular slowness of someone who'd been working hard, but also carrying something heavier than labor. He would wash his hands at the pump, come in, take whatever was on the sideboard. Sometimes he sat at the table. More often, he didn't. He said very little. She didn't push. On the 6th day, she put the list on the table in front of him. He picked it up, read it, set it down, looked at it as if it had told him something he'd been trying not to know. "I can go into town," she said, "or you can, but either way, we need to do it soon." "I know," he said. There's probably enough credit at the general store if that's an issue. It's not, he said, which told her that it probably was, at least partly. She didn't say anything else. He took the list with him the next morning. While he was gone, Marianne did what she always did in houses like this one. She cleaned. Not the aggressive, rearranging kind of cleaning that could feel like judgment. The quiet, methodical kind. She aired out the rooms that had been shut up. She swept the floors and got into the corners where dust had built up into a kind of geology. She found, in a trunk at the back of the master bedroom, which she'd only entered to air the window, some linens that still smelled like lavender from whenever they'd last been washed, and she put them back without disturbing anything else. Clara found her in the hallway at some point during the morning. "You're not supposed to go in there," Clara said. She said it quietly, but she said it. Marianne stopped. "I was just opening the window. It's getting musty." That was her room. Clara's voice was even, controlled. She'd had months of practice keeping it that way. "I know," Marianne said. "I didn't touch anything." Clara looked past her at the half-open door for a long moment. "She smelled like lavender," Clara said then, almost to herself. Not to Marianne, exactly, just saying it into the air. Marianne stood very still. "She sounds like she was a woman worth knowing," she said carefully. Clara's jaw did something complicated. She pulled it back under control. "Don't come in there again," she said, and walked away down the hall. Marianne let her go. She'd learned over the years that grief in children was a different species from grief in adults. Adults could name it, could explain it, could at least move it around, push it into words or silence or drink or work. Children carried it differently. They carried it in their bodies. In the way Clara walked around the edges of rooms, as if she was always keeping something in her peripheral vision. In the way Ben sometimes stopped in the middle of doing something, playing with a piece of rope, looking at a beetle on the porch, and just went very quiet for 10 or 15 seconds, like a candle that had guttered. She didn't try to fix these things. She cooked. She cleaned. She mended. She found a basket of clothes near the stairs that had been sitting so long it had become furniture. Everyone had just stopped seeing it. She sat on the porch in the evenings and worked through it with a needle and thread, doing what could be done and setting aside what couldn't. A shirt of Ben's that had 3 holes in the elbow. Fixable. A dress of Clara's with the hem falling out. Fixable. A pair of Gideon's trousers with the knee worn through. Fixable, if she had the right patch. Ben came and sat beside her on the porch the second evening she did this. He watched her work with the absolute focused attention children gave to mechanical things being done by competent hands. "My mama used to do that," he said. Marianne kept her stitches even. "Did she teach you to sew?" "She was going to," Ben said. He thought about this. "She said it was a useful thing to know, even for boys." She was right. "Do you think she'd mind?" Ben said. "If you did it instead." It was such a careful, considered question from a 6-year-old that Marianne had to breathe before she answered. "I think," she said, "that she'd want these clothes mended, and she'd be glad someone was doing it." Ben seemed to turn this over. "Okay," he said, and leaned against the porch post. They sat that way until the light ran out. Clara was still refusing real meals. She wasn't starving herself. She ate, but she ate the minimum, and she ate it standing up if she could manage it, or at the far end of the table, as if keeping a certain distance from the act of eating, from the act of sitting down to a meal the way families did. Marianne didn't comment on it. She just cooked, and made the food good when she could, and let it sit where Clara could take it when she chose. Then she noticed something. The girl lingered. She didn't sit, never sat, but she would come into the kitchen in the mornings and find a reason to be near the stove, checking something in a cabinet, picking up a cup, standing near the window, and she would watch, without appearing to watch, the way Marianne worked, the way Marianne held the knife when she cut the dried onion, the way she knew when the cornmeal was the right consistency, the way she tested the temperature of the skillet with the flat of her hand from 2 inches away, close enough to feel the heat without touching it. Marianne started narrating what she was doing. Not in the teaching voice, not, "and now we do this and then we do that," just the casual running commentary of someone working alone and speaking to the air. Getting the pan too hot before you add the fat is the fastest way to burn breakfast, she might say, not looking up. Takes about 2 seconds longer to do it right and saves you 20 minutes of scrubbing. Or, you want the water boiling before the beans go in, not after. A lot of people do it the other way and it makes the skins tough. Clara never responded, never acknowledged that she'd heard, but she stayed in the kitchen longer each morning. 3 weeks in, something shifted. Marianne had been in the house long enough now that the rhythms had settled, the way rhythms do. They were still not quite a household yet, not quite functioning on the level of a real family, but they had stopped being a collection of strangers sharing a roof. Something in between, a tenuous middle state. Gideon was still distant. He worked. She gave him that. He worked without stopping from first light to last light, like a man trying to run ahead of something. And he came in and ate and said little. But he no longer looked at the kitchen with the particular blankness he'd had when she first arrived. The flat-eyed absence had taken on something more complicated. On a Sunday morning, near the end of July, he came into the kitchen while she was making biscuits and stopped by the door. "The Harmon family," he said. She kept working the dough. "What about them?" "Their well's running low. I offered to share ours." He paused. "Thought you should know there'll be extra people coming by." She looked up. He was watching her with the wary expression of a man who'd made a decision and wasn't sure if it was going to get criticized. "How many?" she said. "3 of them. Mrs. Harmon and her 2 boys. I'll make enough for 5, she said. "It's no trouble." He looked at her for a moment. "Thank you," he said. "Of course," she said. He left. She went back to the biscuits. She didn't make a thing of it, but she noticed. He'd thought to tell her. He'd thought to include her in the decision, in the small domestic way that people who are actually living together learn to do. Something had shifted. The Harmon boys were 8 and 10, loud and scuffed at the knees the way that boys that age always were. Their mother, Nora Harmon, was a compact woman of about 40 with very direct eyes and a handshake that meant business. She came into the kitchen while Marianne was cooking and stood in the doorway in the exact spot where Clara always stood. "You're the one who answered Gideon's notice," she said. "I am," Marianne said. Nora looked around the kitchen, not rudely, but thoroughly, taking stock. "It looks different in here," she said. "I cleaned." "More than that," Nora folded her arms. "I've been in this kitchen a dozen times since March. It looked like a place nobody lived in." She paused. "It looks like a kitchen again." Marianne said nothing. "The children eating?" Nora asked. "Yes." "Clara too?" "Yes." A pause. "More each day." Nora made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Then she said, "Gideon won't tell you this because Gideon doesn't tell anyone anything. But before Ruth died, she spent the last week she had writing down all her recipes. Every single one." She paused. "He put the book somewhere. Hasn't looked at it since." Marianne was very still. "I thought you should know," Nora said. "In case it matters." She left the kitchen as directly as she'd arrived. Marianne didn't go looking for the recipe book. She wouldn't do that. It wasn't her place, and she knew it. But she thought about it. That night, she sat at the kitchen table after the children were in bed and the house was quiet, and she thought about a woman she'd never met. A woman who knew she was dying and spent whatever energy she had left writing down the things she knew how to make so that somebody, someday, could still feed her family. It was an act of love so practical and so unbearably sad that Marianne had to press the heels of her hands against her eyes for a moment. She sat like that in the quiet kitchen, and then she got up and put the lamp out and went to bed. August was brutal. The drought that had been a present since before she'd arrived became a pressure, something with weight, something you felt pushing down on the flat of the land. The creek east of the ranch dropped to a trickle. Neighboring ranches reported the same. The crops that had managed to survive until now started failing in earnest, and with them went the patience that desperate people hold on to for as long as they can. In town, she heard things. A family named Gruber had left, packed everything on a wagon, and gone north in the night without saying goodbye to anyone. The Prescott Ranch had lost their entire corn yield. Two men had a fight outside the saloon about a fence line that hadn't mattered until the water started running short. She walked back from town one afternoon with this sitting in her chest like a stone, and she found Gideon on the porch, standing very still and looking east. "You heard about the Grubers," she said, "this morning." She stood beside him on the porch. They were both looking east at the flat, colorless sky. "You thinking about leaving?" she said. It wasn't quite a question. He was quiet for so long she thought he wasn't going to answer. "It crosses my mind," he said finally. She waited. "Ruthie." He stopped, started again. He loved this place, that's the thing. His voice was very flat. Even when things were bad. She used to say. He stopped again. Marianne said nothing. She just stood there. She said there was no point running from hard times because hard times had good legs, Gideon said. She said you might as well dig in. The afternoon was dead quiet, not even wind. She was right about most things, he said, and something broke very slightly in the edge of his voice, not dramatically, just the small fracture of a man saying something true that hurt. Marianne looked at the sky. "The fence on the east side needs work," she said after a moment. He blinked at her. "What?" "I noticed it yesterday. 2 posts are loose. If a storm comes up, I know about the fence." "I know you know." She turned to look at him. "I'm just saying there's work to do." A pause. "There's always work to do." He looked at her for a moment, really looked at her, in a way he hadn't done since the first day, like he was trying to read something. "You're not soft," he said. "No," she agreed. He almost smiled. It didn't quite make it, but something changed in his face that was the rough equivalent of a smile. He turned and went inside. Marianne stayed on the porch for a while longer, looking east, and then she went back into the kitchen. September was when it cracked. The crack came not in one dramatic place, but in many places at once, the way a drought finally breaks, not with a single rain, but with pressure from a dozen directions. Clara came into the kitchen on a September morning and stood in her usual spot by the window. Marianne was making porridge with the last of the cornmeal. Clara stood there for longer than usual. She picked up an onion from the shelf and turned it over in her hands. "How do you cut it so fast?" she said. Marianne kept her expression neutral. "Practice," she said. A pause. "Could you—" Clara stopped. Tried again. "Would you show me?" Marianne put down the spoon. "Come here," she said. It wasn't a moment. It wasn't a breakthrough she could have described at the time. It was just a girl and a woman standing at a kitchen table, and Marianne guiding Clara's hands on the knife, showing her the angle, the motion, the way to keep your knuckles curled so the blade moved along them safely. Clara was focused in the exact way her father was focused, completely, almost intensely, like the task was the only thing in the world. "Like this?" Clara asked. "Exactly like that." Clara cut the onion. Her eyes watered and she blinked fiercely, refusing to acknowledge it. "It's the vapor," Marianne said. "Everyone's eyes water. It's not crying." "I know it's not crying," Clara said, with a firmness that suggested she very much needed it not to be crying. "Of course," Marianne said. They finished breakfast together. Nothing was said about it. It was simply a thing that happened. But later that day, when Marianne was in the garden turning over the dry soil, trying to figure out what, if anything, might survive if they got rain soon, she heard footsteps behind her. She turned. Clara was standing at the edge of the garden with something in her hands. A book. Small, cloth-covered, dark blue. She held it out. Marianne went still. "I found where Papa put it," Clara said. Her voice was very controlled. "It's Mama's." She paused. "I thought—" She stopped. "Maybe you could use some of the recipes, since you're cooking anyway." Marianne looked at the book. Looked at Clara. "Are you sure?" she said. Clara's chin went up a fraction of an inch. That particular act of determination, that was maybe the most Ruth-like thing Marianne had ever seen in her, though she'd never met Ruth. "She wrote them down so somebody would use them," Clara said. "That's the point of writing things down." Marianne took the book. She held it carefully. "Thank you, Clara," she said. Clara nodded once, sharply, and walked back toward the house. Marianne looked down at the cloth-covered book in her hands, at the slight wear at the spine where it had been held and read many times over. She opened the cover. Ruth Hart. Her kitchen. Her hand. The handwriting was clear and practical and had been written by someone who meant to be useful. Marianne closed the book. She held it against her chest for a moment. Then she went inside to start dinner. Ruth Hart's recipe book smelled like dried herbs and something faintly sweet. Maybe the molasses she'd used, or maybe just the paper itself, old and slightly soft at the edges from years of hands. Marianne sat with it at the kitchen table that first night after Clara had given it to her, after the children were in bed and the house had gone quiet, and she read through it the way you read a letter from someone you wished you'd known. The recipes were precise without being rigid. Ruth had written notes in the margins. Add more salt if the beans are old, they need it. And don't rush the onions, 20 minutes at least. I know it feels too long, but it isn't. And once, on a page for apple cake, just the single word Ben's favorite, with a small star drawn next to it. Marianne closed the book after an hour and sat with her hands flat on the table. She wasn't a sentimental woman. She hadn't had the luxury of it. But there was something about that book, about the practical, specific love written into every margin note, that sat in her chest and didn't move. She put it on the kitchen shelf, spine facing out. She'd use it. That was the only decent thing to do with it. The following morning, she made Ruth's cornmeal porridge. The recipe had a note that said, add a spoon of molasses when you have it. Makes it something the kids will actually want. And when Ben came downstairs and saw the pot on the stove, something moved across his face. Quick, like a shadow. He sat down without being asked. Clara came in, saw the pot, and stopped walking. Marianne kept her back to them and stirred. It's different, Clara said finally. It's from the book, Marianne said. The kitchen was very quiet. Clara pulled out her chair and sat down. She didn't say anything else, she just sat. And when Marianne put the bowl in front of her, she ate it, all of it, without pushing it away or leaving half. Marianne washed the pot and said nothing, and counted it as something. The ranch in September had a particular quality of light, a low gold that came in sideways through the kitchen window in the mornings and made everything look warmer than it was. The air had started to cool at night, just barely, just enough that you noticed when you went out before dawn to start the fire. The drought hadn't broken. The soil was still hard and pale as bone, but the absolute suffocation of August had eased a fraction, and in that fraction there was something that felt, tentatively, like the possibility of breathing. Marianne had started going through the root cellar under the house. She'd found it on her third day, a low door set into the kitchen floor, the kind you could miss if you weren't looking. And she'd opened it and looked down into the cool dark and smelled earth and old wood and not much else. But she'd gone back to it now with a proper inventory in mind because September meant winter was a real thing on the horizon, not an abstraction. What she found was not encouraging. Some dried apples from the previous year, wizened and hard. A crock of pickled cabbage. A small sack of dried peas, maybe 10 pounds. A few jars of preserves, peach, she thought, and possibly plum. But 3 of the 7 jars had cracked lids, and she wasn't sure how long they'd been sitting. She sat down on the cellar steps and did the arithmetic in her head, and the arithmetic was not good. She went looking for Gideon. He was where he usually was at that hour, out near the east fence, doing the repair work she'd mentioned weeks ago. She walked out and stood near him while he worked, not interrupting, because she'd learned that he was a man who needed to finish a thought before he could start a new one. He drove the post anchor in, checked the tension on the wire, and then straightened up and looked at her. Root cellar, she said. I know. Do you? He wiped his hands on the back of his trousers and looked at the fence line. I haven't been down there since spring. There's not enough for winter, she said. Not if it's just what's down there. We'd need to put up a lot more in the next 4 or 5 weeks. He was quiet. The preserving jars, half of them are cracked or sealed wrong, she continued. We'd need new ones. And produce. The garden's mostly gone, but if we got rain this week, the turnips might still come through. And we'd need to think about meat. I know all of this, he said. I know you know. She folded her arms. I'm telling you so we can talk about what we're going to do about it. He looked at her then. That same look he'd given her on the porch weeks ago. The one that seemed to be trying to decide something about her. He didn't look hostile. He looked like a man who had gotten very used to having these conversations alone in his own head and wasn't quite sure how to have them out loud with someone else. Money's tight, he said. I figured. The spring crop was... He stopped. The spring crop had been Ruth's death, and the funeral and 2 months of a man barely getting out of bed, and everything that hadn't been done in those months. He didn't have to say it. "I can go into town," Marianne said. "Talk to the store, see what kind of arrangement might be worked out." "I'll do it." "I know you will. I'm offering to help." He looked away at the fence. His jaw was set in a way she was learning to read. Not anger exactly, but resistance. The resistance of a man who had been carrying everything alone for so long that the act of setting something down felt like giving up. "Gideon?" she said. He looked at her. "Two people working a problem is faster than one," she said simply. "That's all." He was quiet for another moment, then he said, "I'll go to town tomorrow. You can come." It wasn't gracious, but it was offered, and she took it. "Good," she said, and walked back to the house. That night she found him at the kitchen table after supper, with Ruth's recipe book open in front of him. He hadn't heard her come back downstairs, and for a moment she stood in the doorway and watched him. He was just looking at the page. Not reading, she thought, just looking at the handwriting. His thumb was resting on the edge of the paper, not quite touching the words. She went back upstairs without saying anything. Some things a person needed to do alone. The trip into town the next morning was the first time she and Gideon had gone anywhere together, and it had the slightly awkward quality of two people who know each other at home but aren't quite sure how to occupy the same space outside of it. He drove the wagon. She sat on the bench beside him. The road was dry and the wheels raised dust behind them. For the first mile, neither of them spoke. It was Ben who eventually broke it. He'd asked to come, and Gideon had said yes after a pause that suggested he hadn't quite thought through the implications. And now the boy was sitting in the wagon bed behind them, conducting an ongoing narration of everything he saw. "There's a hawk," Ben announced. "That's a big hawk." "Papa, is that a red-tail?" "Red-tail," Gideon confirmed. "How can you tell from here?" "The color on the tail when it turns." Ben considered this. "Marianne, can you tell?" "I take your father's word on it," she said. "He knows this land better than I do." Gideon glanced at her sideways. Brief, barely a glance, but she noticed it. "She's only been here a month," Ben told the hawk, as if updating it on the situation. 5 weeks, Marianne said. "Is that longer than a month?" "By a few days." Ben thought about this. "It feels longer," he said, in the matter-of-fact way of children who had no idea they were saying something that mattered. Gideon kept his eyes on the road, but she saw his hands relax, very slightly, on the reins. Old Mr. Carver at the general store, the man with the white mustache who'd given her directions on the day she arrived, looked at the two of them coming in together with an expression that was carefully non-committal, which meant he noticed and was choosing not to make a show of it. The conversation about credit was conducted privately, between Gideon and Carver, while Marianne took Ben to look at the penny candy display. She kept half her attention on the conversation behind her, not deliberately eavesdropping, just aware. She heard Gideon's voice, low and even, heard Carver's response, heard a pause, and then the scratch of a pen on paper. When Gideon came to find her, his jaw was still set, but he put 4 jars of preserving wax on the counter alongside the other things without explaining himself. She didn't ask. They loaded the wagon, jars, dried goods, a bolt of oilcloth she needed for the root cellar shelves, and on the way back, Ben fell asleep in the wagon bed with his head on a flour sack. They rode in quieter than they'd ridden in. Not uncomfortable, just quiet. Carver extended the credit, Gideon said eventually. "I heard the pen." He said, Gideon stopped. "He said the ranch looked to be doing better. Word gets around." A pause. "He meant you." Marianne looked at the road ahead. "He meant the ranch is doing better. That's about all of us." Gideon said nothing, but he didn't argue. The week that followed was the hardest Marianne had worked since arriving. Not the grinding, sorrowful kind of hard that the first weeks had been, but the productive kind. The kind that left you tired in a way that felt honest. She put up preserves from the turnips that had managed to come through in the garden. Not as many as she'd hoped, but enough to matter. She sealed the root cellar shelves with the oilcloth to keep the moisture out. She and Clara spent 2 afternoons drying apple slices over the stove. The apples came from the Harmon farm, a trade Nora Harmon had offered in exchange for the use of the well, and Marianne had accepted without making a thing of it. Clara, during those 2 afternoons, talked, not about anything weighty. She talked the way people talked when their hands were busy, about nothing in particular, which was to say about everything. She told Marianne about a horse her father had traded for 2 years ago, a roan mare named Pepper, that she had loved completely, and that had gone lame last winter. She told Marianne about her teacher at the school in town, a young woman from Ohio who'd left at the end of last spring and hadn't been replaced yet. She told Marianne about a girl named Dottie Prescott, who had been her closest friend until the Prescott family's troubles had made things strange between them. Marianne listened and cut apple slices and asked the right questions at the right intervals and did not offer opinions she hadn't been asked for. On the second afternoon, Clara said, "Do you think Dottie blames us?" Marianne considered this honestly. Blames you for what? For having water when they don't. People in hard times look for someone to be angry at, Marianne said. It doesn't mean the anger makes sense. Clara thought about this, turning an apple slice over in her hands. Mama used to say that the people most worth keeping were the ones who were decent to you when things were bad, she said. Your mother was right, Marianne said. Clara set the apple slice on the drying rack. She was right about most things, she said, and her voice had the same quality her father's had when he'd said those same words about Ruth on the porch that August afternoon. The same flatness over the same crack beneath it. Marianne looked at the girl beside her and felt something so sharp and so particular that she didn't try to name it. I know, she said quietly. Clara didn't respond. She just reached for the next apple. It was Nora Harmon who first said it out loud, the thing that had been taking shape in the background of all these weeks, like a weather system building on the horizon. She came by on a Wednesday, ostensibly to return the jar she'd borrowed and to bring 2 pounds of dried beans she'd found at the back of her own cellar. She came into the kitchen. She always came directly into the kitchen now, bypassing the front room with the easy familiarity of someone who had been coming to a house long enough that she didn't need to be shown around, and set the beans on the table and looked at Marianne with those direct eyes of hers. You're staying, Nora said. Marianne looked up from the bread she was kneading. I'm sorry? You're staying. Nora sat down at the table without being asked. I don't mean next week. I mean you're not leaving in the spring. Marianne kept working the dough. I haven't thought that far. Yes, you have. Marianne pressed her knuckles into the bread and didn't say anything. Nora was quiet for a moment. I'm not prying, she said, which was not entirely true. I just want you to know that this town, what's left of it, needs people who dig in. We've lost 3 families in 2 months, the Grubers, the Pattersons, a family named Cole that I don't think anyone knew very well. She paused. The families who stay are going to be the ones who hold it together. And the Hart Ranch... She stopped. What about it? It was the center once, Nora said. Before Ruth died, people came here. There were meals, it was where things happened. She looked at Marianne steadily. It could be that again. Marianne put the bread dough in the bowl and covered it with a cloth. That's a lot to put on a housekeeper, she said. You and I both know you're not just a housekeeper, Nora said. Marianne wiped her hands on her apron and looked out the window. The yard was dry and pale, and the single boot was still by the fence post. She kept forgetting to move it, kept seeing it and thinking tomorrow, and then forgetting. Something about that boot had become almost like a landmark to her. I don't know what I am, Marianne said. Came out more honestly than she'd intended. Nora seemed to understand that this was not an invitation for advice, and she didn't give any. She picked up her empty jar and stood. You'll figure it out, she said. You strike me as a woman who usually does. She left Marianne alone with the rising bread and the boot outside the window, and the question she hadn't answered. The thing about Gideon, the thing that was becoming increasingly hard to ignore, was that he was changing. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't a single moment, it was the accumulation of small things that individually could be explained away, but together amounted to something she couldn't quite sidestep anymore. He had started coming to dinner, not every night, maybe 3 nights out of 7, sometimes 4. He would wash up at the pump and come in and sit at the end of the table. Always the end, always slightly removed, like a man standing in the doorway of a room instead of all the way inside it. And he would eat and listen to whatever Ben was talking about, which was always something, because Ben had opinions about everything from fence posts to the migratory habits of ducks. He had started talking to her, not about large things, about the ranch mostly. The water situation, the feed supply, the condition of the herd, the practical, operational language of a working farm. But there was a quality to the way he said things now that was different from the early weeks. Less reporting, more conversation. Like a man who had gotten used to having someone to talk to and was figuring out, cautiously, how far that went. One evening, he came into the kitchen while she was cleaning up and stood there longer than the situation required. "The Harmon boys helped me with the barn roof today," he said. "I know, Ben told me. He said the older one dropped a hammer and it nearly hit your horse." A pause. "Nearly? Ben made it sound like it nearly hit you." Ben exaggerates. "He's 6. He's been 6 his whole life," Gideon said, "and he's been exaggerating the whole time. It wasn't a joke, exactly. It was delivered flat and without any visible effort at humor. But something in the way he said it, the tired, dry affection of a man describing something that exhausted him and that he loved, made Marianne stop wiping the counter for a second. "He told me Pepper was your daughter's horse," she said. Gideon's expression shifted, just slightly. She was. "She said she loved that horse. She cried for 2 days when we had to retire her," he said. "Wouldn't come down to breakfast." He paused. "Ruth finally took her up a plate and sat with her on the floor. They sat up there for an hour." He stopped. Marianne kept her hands on the counter and waited. "I couldn't," he started, stopped again. "At the time I thought Ruth was letting her get away with something. I thought Clara needed to understand that—" He pressed his lips together. "Animals die. Crops fail. Things get lost. I thought she needed to understand that." "She understands that now," Marianne said carefully. The words landed and he felt them. She could see it in the way he went very still. "I know," he said. There was nothing to add to that, and she didn't try. The silence sat between them for a moment that was not comfortable, but was, she thought, at least honest. "Good night, Gideon," she said. "Good night," he said, and he went. She stood in the empty kitchen and pressed her palms flat on the cool surface of the counter and exhaled slowly. She'd been careful. She'd been careful the whole 5 weeks. She knew what happened when a woman in her situation, a stranger brought into a grieving household, let herself care too much or too visibly or in the wrong direction. She'd watched it go wrong for other women. She'd told herself when she stepped off that train that she was here to work, to cook and clean and keep the children fed. That was the arrangement, and she would honor it. But she was also not a fool. She blew out the lamp and went upstairs and lay in the dark and listened to the house settle around her, the old familiar sounds of wood contracting in the night air. And she thought about Nora's question, and she thought about Clara cutting onions at the table, and about Ben asleep in the wagon bed with his head on a flour sack, and she thought about a man with flat gray eyes that weren't quite flat anymore. She didn't sleep well that night, but she was up before dawn, same as always, and she lit the stove and started the coffee and got on with it. That was the other thing she was good at. The rain, when it finally came, arrived on a Thursday afternoon in late September. Not the gentle, redemptive kind of rain that arrives like an apology, but the violent kind, the kind that had been held back too long and came all at once without any of the manners of ordinary weather. It announced itself an hour before it arrived, the way the worst storms did, with a yellow tinge to the sky in the west, and a stillness so complete that the animals felt it before any person did. Marianne saw it from the kitchen window. She watched the quality of the light change and set down what she was doing and went to find Gideon. He was already moving. He'd seen the sky and he knew the land, and he was going for the animals before she'd even reached the barn door. She met him coming out. "Get the children inside," he said, not stopping. "Shut the windows." She went. Ben was in the yard, and she took him by the hand without discussion and brought him in. Clara she found in the upstairs hall, and they went through the upper floor together, closing windows, quick and efficient, moving from room to room in the particular coordinated way that people developed when they'd been in the same space long enough to know each other's movements. They got back to the kitchen, and the rain hit. It hit like something that had been angry about something else and was taking it out on the land. The windows vibrated. The sound on the roof was not pattering or drumming. It was the flat, hammering roar of water that meant business. Ben pressed his face against the kitchen window with his hands cupped around his eyes, trying to see past the sheet of water on the glass. "Papa's still out there," he said. He knows what he's doing, Marianne said. What if the barn floods? Then your father deals with a flooded barn. He's done it before. How do you know? Because he's dealt with everything else, she said, which was not quite an answer but was close enough, and Ben seemed to accept it. Clara was standing in the kitchen doorway with her arms folded, looking toward the window. She didn't say anything, but she didn't move away either. The storm ran itself out in about 40 minutes, shorter than the buildup had threatened, and Marianne suspected that was both a relief and not quite enough. She'd heard enough about the drought to know that one September rain, even a violent one, wasn't going to fix what months of dry had done. When Gideon came in, he was soaked through. He stood on the kitchen floor and dripped and looked like a man who'd been in an argument with the weather, and both parties had come out of it battered. Animals? Marianne asked. Fine. Barn took some water at the south end. Not bad. He ran a hand over his face. Creek's up. How much? Enough. He looked past her toward the window. The rain had slacked to a serious but manageable fall. The Harmon place is lower than us. If this keeps up tonight, go, she said. He looked at her. I'll keep the children, she said. Go check on them. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't quite read. It had something in it that she recognized without wanting to examine too closely. And then he nodded and went back out into the rain. He didn't come back for 3 hours. When he did, he brought Nora Harmon and both her boys. Lower Field's flooded, he said, standing in the kitchen doorway with 4 wet people behind him and the look of a man who had already made one decision and was waiting to see if anyone was going to argue with the next one. They can't stay there tonight. Marianne was already getting blankets. That night, the Hart house had 7 people in it, 4 adults and 3 children and 1 very confused cat that had materialized from somewhere and taken up residence on the kitchen windowsill. Nora and Marianne fed everyone from what was there. It was not fancy. It was beans and the last of the cornbread and dried apple slices, and they made it stretch the way women who knew scarcity made things stretch, by not wasting and not asking questions. The children ate at the table together, all 5 of them, in one loud mass of talking and stealing food from each other's plates and arguing about nothing important. Clara sat at the table. She sat at the table and she ate her dinner, and she was Marianne registered, talking to Nora's older boy about something. A complaint about the quality of the fishing on the creek this summer, if she was hearing it right. And she was talking the way 11-year-olds talked when they forgot they'd decided not to talk. Too fast. Too much. With her hands moving. Gideon sat down. He didn't sit at the end of the table this time. He sat at the middle because Nora's boys had taken the ends, and he just sat there, in the middle of his own table, with people around him and noise and a plate in front of him, and after a moment he just started eating. He caught Marianne's eye across the table. She looked away first. Later, when the children were settled and Nora had taken the small bedroom off the kitchen and the house was as quiet as 7 people could make it, Marianne sat on the porch steps in the dark and listened to the rain, which had come down to a steady, soft thing now, the kind that actually soaked in rather than ran off. The door opened behind her. Footsteps. Gideon sat down on the step beside her, not close, a respectable distance, and said nothing. They sat in the dark and listened to the rain fall on dry land. She would have liked tonight, he said. Marianne knew who he meant. Full house, she said. She always said the table should have extra chairs, he said. I thought she was being impractical. He was quiet. She wasn't impractical about much. The rain said what words couldn't. After a while, Gideon said, Why did you come here, to Red Hollow? Of all the notices you could have answered. Marianne thought about it honestly. The letter was short, she said. That made you choose it? Men who write short letters usually mean what they say. She paused. I've worked for men who wrote very long letters and meant almost none of it. He was quiet for a moment. The letter didn't say much. No, but it said what mattered. She looked at the dark yard, at the rain moving through the lamplight from the kitchen window. 2 children, a ranch, work. She paused. Sometimes that's enough to go on. He didn't respond, but he didn't go inside either. They sat on the porch until the rain slowed to almost nothing, and then he stood up and said goodnight and went in, and Marianne stayed a few minutes longer by herself, watching the water collect in the hollows of the dry yard, and thinking about all the things that were, slowly and imperfectly, and with considerable effort, beginning to grow. The rain that Thursday night soaked into the ground about 2 inches and then stopped, which was better than nothing and not nearly enough. By Saturday morning, the surface of the yard was already hardening again at the edges, the way desperate land did, drinking fast and then sealing itself against the possibility of more disappointment. The creek stayed up for 3 days. The Harmon lower field drained slowly. Nora and her boys went home on Sunday with a jar of dried apples and a quiet between her and Marianne that had the quality of an understanding neither of them had needed to say out loud. The ranch felt different after that night, not fixed, not transformed into something easier, but different in the way a room felt different after you'd opened a window that had been stuck all winter. Same room, same furniture, same walls, but the air had moved through it and left something changed. Gideon started coming to dinner every night. He didn't announce this. He didn't make a thing of it. He simply appeared at the table, washed and quiet, in the reliable way that suggested he'd made some internal decision and wasn't going to discuss it. The first 2 nights, Ben talked enough for everyone. The third night, Clara told a story about something that had happened years ago. A raccoon that had gotten into the kitchen and knocked over a crock of molasses and tracked it through 3 rooms. And the way she told it was so unexpectedly funny, in a dry, understated way that was entirely her father's, that Gideon made a sound that was almost a laugh. Almost. Marianne looked down at her plate and said nothing, but she heard it. October arrived with a cold that had teeth, the kind of cold that reminded you Kansas wasn't playing its seasons, that winter out here was a real and serious thing. The mornings went from cool to genuinely bitter almost overnight, and Marianne added a second layer to Ben's clothes and dug out the heavier blankets from the chest in the upstairs hall and put more wood on the pile beside the porch. The drought had technically broken. There'd been 2 more rains since the Thursday storm, both smaller, both insufficient. But broken and healed were different things, and every family within 10 miles of Red Hollow was working from the same grim arithmetic, what they had put up divided by how long they needed it to last. The news from other ranches wasn't good. Tom Prescott came by on a Tuesday, Dottie's father, the one whose corn had failed entirely back in August, and he sat on the porch with Gideon for an hour while Marianne worked in the kitchen with the window cracked an inch. She wasn't trying to listen, but voices carried. Prescott's voice was the voice of a man at the edge of something, tight and controlled on the surface and fraying underneath, the way a rope looked right before it snapped. "I can't feed them through February," he said. "I've run the numbers 6 different ways." Gideon said something she didn't catch. "I'm not asking for charity," Prescott said, sharper. I'm not. I don't know what I'm saying." A pause. "Margaret thinks we should go north. Her sister's in Nebraska." Silence. "What do you think?" Gideon said. Another pause. "I think I've been on this land for 11 years, and I don't know who I am if I leave it." Marianne stopped what she was doing and stood very still. She heard Gideon say quietly, "I know." When Prescott left, Gideon came into the kitchen and stood near the doorway in that way he had, close enough to talk, not quite committing to staying. "Prescotts are struggling," he said. "I heard." He looked at her. Not accusatory, just checking. "Their corn went in August," she said. "I've been thinking about it." She turned from the stove. "How much dried corn do we have in the cellar?" He thought about it. "Maybe 40 pounds. Maybe a little more." "What would it take to get through winter with 30? He was quiet for a moment, doing the same arithmetic she'd done. "Tight," he said, "but manageable." "Then we can spare 10 pounds, she said. "And I expect the Harmons could spare something too. Between 2 households, we could put together a parcel that would make a real difference." He looked at her steadily. "It's not charity," she said, before he could say what she knew he was thinking. "It's neighbors." "Prescott won't take it easy." "No," she agreed. "He won't. But his daughter is Clara's friend, and Margaret Prescott doesn't have that kind of pride." She paused. "Men's pride is a costly thing in winter." Something flickered in his face. "You're not wrong," he said, which, from Gideon Hart, was about as close to your right as she'd heard him get. He went to the cellar. She heard him moving things around down there. When he came back up, he had a cloth sack in his hands that he set on the table without comment, and she understood that she was to handle the rest of it. She went to see Nora the next morning. Nora's response to the plan was immediate and practical. She added dried beans and a small sack of wheat flour to the parcel, then stood back with her arms folded and said, "Someone should go with you. Prescott will take it better from Gideon." "Gideon knows," Marianne said. "He's going?" "He loaded the corn this morning." Nora looked at her for a moment with those direct eyes. "Something's different with him," she said. Marianne picked up the flour sack. "People change when things get easier to bear," she said carefully. Nora made the sound she made when she thought someone was underselling something but had decided not to push. She helped carry the parcels to the wagon. The visit to the Prescott ranch was not easy. Marianne had expected that. Tom Prescott came out onto his porch when he heard the wagon and watched them pull up with an expression that moved through surprise and something like relief, and then hardened into the defensive pride of a man who had spent too long being the one who provided and couldn't easily be the one who received. Gideon got down from the wagon first. "We had extra from the cellar," he said. He said it the way you'd say it looks like rain, flat, factual, not inviting argument. "You do the same." Prescott looked at the parcels in the wagon bed. His jaw worked. "Gideon, you do the same," Gideon said again. Steady. No room in it for the other man's pride to find purchase. There was a long pause. Marianne stayed on the wagon bench and looked at the middle distance and let the two men work it out, because she understood that some things needed to happen without a woman watching. Eventually she heard Tom Prescott say, quietly, "Thank you." And Gideon, "Get Margaret to come out. Marianne's got instructions for the flour." She climbed down and met Margaret Prescott at the bottom of the porch steps, a thin, tired woman with intelligent eyes and a grip that was firmer than her frame suggested. And they stood in the yard and talked about winter flour storage for 10 minutes, which was what they needed to talk about and also not really what they were talking about. When they drove back toward the ranch, the afternoon had gone cold and thin. Ben was home with Clara. They'd left him with strict instructions and a task involving shelling the remainder of the dried beans, which he'd accepted with the gravity of a boy assigned an important mission. Gideon drove. Marianne sat beside him. The road was quiet. "That was the right thing," she said. "I know. I know, Marianne." She was quiet then. "You didn't know how to do it before." He didn't say anything for a moment. The horse's hooves on the dry road made the only sound. "Before, I couldn't see past the fence line," he said. His voice was very even. "Everything beyond the ranch felt distant, like it belonged to a different life." A pause. Ruth was the one who kept track of the neighbors, who knew when someone needed something. He was quiet again. "After she died, I just stopped." Marianne watched the road unspooling ahead of them. "It wasn't only grief," he said. Then he stopped, like he'd said more than he meant to. She waited. He didn't continue. She didn't push. But she heard the space where the rest of the sentence would have gone, and she thought she understood the shape of it. It wasn't only grief, it was something else. Something that had to do with guilt and promise, and a man who believed he had already failed the people most counting on him and didn't see the point in trying further. She would learn the full shape of it eventually. Not yet. The parcel to the Prescotts turned out to be the beginning of something Marianne hadn't entirely planned but recognized when it started happening. Word got around, because word always got around in small towns. It traveled in the particular way of small town information, through wives in general stores and men talking at fence lines, that the Hart Ranch had spare food and that Marianne Voss had organized it. Within a week, she had 3 conversations at the general store with women she'd only nodded at before. Carver's wife, a solid woman named Edna, who ran the store's back office, stopped her on the way out one morning and asked, bluntly, whether she had any thoughts on the preserving situation in the valley. "What do you mean?" Marianne asked. "I mean, there are 6 families in this area who put up less than half what they needed this summer. Most of them don't have enough jars, or they have jars and don't have enough produce, or they have produce, and it's the wrong kind to put up alone." Edna folded her hands on the counter. "I'm thinking if we pooled what people have and spent 2 days at the church hall." "I'll come," Marianne said, "and I can ask the Harmons." Edna looked at her. "You understand this is a lot of work." "I understand that," Marianne said. "Some of these women don't know each other well. There'll be friction." "Probably," Marianne said. There's friction in most things worth doing. Edna considered this for a moment and then, for the first time in their limited acquaintance, actually smiled. Tuesday, she said, 8 in the morning. Marianne was there at 7:45. It was, in fact, a lot of work, and Edna had been right about the friction. 3 of the women had some long-standing issue with each other that Marianne was not privy to and didn't ask about, and there was an hour in the middle of the second day when the whole enterprise threatened to dissolve over something so small she couldn't even track how it started. She put a pot of coffee on the hall stove and moved 2 of the women to a different table and didn't take sides, and gradually the irritation burned down to something workable. What they produced over those 2 days was, by the math of the valley's winter needs, significant. 34 quarts of preserved vegetables, 20 pounds of dried apple, enough pickled cabbage to make several households very tired of pickled cabbage by February, which was better than the alternative. It was not a triumph. It was just practical, exhausting, imperfect cooperation between people who didn't entirely like each other, but were cold and worried and understood, at the level where real decisions got made, that they needed each other. Clara heard about it when Marianne came home the second evening. She was in the kitchen. She was often in the kitchen now, in the late afternoons, doing things that didn't quite require an explanation, and she listened while Marianne described the day without much editorializing. Mrs. Gruder came, Clara said. She and Mrs. Fitch haven't spoken since that business with the fence line. I'm aware, Marianne said, sitting down heavily. How'd you manage it? Coffee and table placement, Marianne said. Clara almost smiled. It was the kind of almost smile she'd started producing occasionally. It arrived and vanished so fast you could convince yourself you'd imagined it, except that you hadn't. Mama would have found that funny, Clara said. Would she have? She always said the key to managing difficult women was geography. Clara picked up a knife and started cutting the onion Marianne had been intending to get to. Put them far enough apart and they behave. Marianne looked at the girl at the counter, cutting onions now without being asked or told, without needing anyone to show her the knife angle, and felt the complicated tightness in her chest that she'd stopped trying to name. Your mother was a smart woman, she said. The smartest person I knew, Clara said simply. She kept cutting. I used to think it wasn't fair that she knew so much, and then she stopped, set the knife down, picked it up again. I used to think it wasn't fair, she said again, because the first time she'd said it, she hadn't finished the thought, and she wasn't going to finish it this time either. It isn't, Marianne said. Clara looked at her. It isn't fair, Marianne said again. Some things just aren't, and there's no amount of making sense of it that makes it fair. Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she went back to the onion. Okay, she said. Just that. But she didn't stop cutting, which meant something. The night the storm hit Red Hollow in earnest was the 14th of October, and nobody was ready for it in the way you were never quite ready for something you knew was coming but couldn't time. Marianne heard it change in the afternoon, the particular drop in temperature that came ahead of a serious storm, a drop that happened in your skin before it happened in your thoughts. She went to Gideon, who was in the barn. We need to talk about the Harmons, she said. He was nailing a loose board on the stall wall, and he stopped. What about them? Their roof was bad after the September rain. Nora told me the east corner's been letting water in. She looked at the sky through the barn door, the sky that had gone the particular yellow-gray of serious winter weather. If this is what I think it is, I'll go, he said. He put down the hammer. Take the extra tarp from the cellar, she said. The heavy one. And rope. He looked at her. You've thought this through. I've been thinking about it since yesterday, she said, when the temperature started dropping. He studied her face for a moment. That thing he'd been doing more lately, looking at her in a way that was less about assessing and more about something she couldn't quite characterize. Stay with the children, he said. Keep the fire going. Obviously, she said, and he almost smiled, actually almost, the closest he'd gotten yet, and went to get the tarp. She watched him ride out toward the Harmon place, and then went inside and got every blanket she could find and stoked both fireplaces and put a large pot of something on the stove, because whatever happened tonight, people were going to come in cold. The storm came at 7 in the evening. It was not like the September rain. The September rain had been violent and temporary, a weather system with a temper. This was the other kind, sustained, cold, deliberate, The kind of storm that didn't have a temper because it didn't have a mood at all. It just came, and it intended to stay for a while. Wind drove the rain nearly horizontal against the windows. The temperature outside dropped 12 degrees in 2 hours. Ben had stationed himself at the kitchen window with the focused vigilance of a small sentry watching for his father's return. "He'll be a while," Marianne said. "Come and eat." "What if the Harmon roof collapses?" "Then your father will have done what he went to do and they'll shelter here tonight." "What if he can't make it back?" "Then he stays there tonight. Your father knows what he's doing in bad weather." "How do you know that?" "Because he's been on this land for years," she said. "And because I've watched him work. He doesn't make careless decisions." Ben considered this with the measuring look he sometimes got, a look that was entirely too old for his face. "Do you like my papa?" he said. Marianne got up and brought him a bowl of stew without answering. "It's a real question," Ben said. "It's a complicated question," she said. "It doesn't seem complicated." "Eat your stew, Ben." He ate his stew, but he watched her with those dark eyes that missed considerably less than people gave him credit for. Clara was quiet that night, eating her supper and then sitting near the fireplace with a book she wasn't quite reading. Marianne sat across from her and mended one of Ben's shirts and listened to the storm outside and tried not to think too hard about what was happening 2 miles away at the Harmon place. She'd learned over the years that worrying in detail was less useful than worrying in general and then doing something with your hands. So she kept her hands moving and listened to the storm and waited. Gideon came back at 10 o'clock. He came back with Nora and both boys. He was soaked to the bone and there was a cut on the back of his hand. Not bad, but real. And he moved through the door with the controlled exhaustion of someone who'd been working hard in bad conditions for 3 hours. The Harmon boys came in behind him and stood dripping on the kitchen floor, looking both shaken and thrilled in the way that boys were when something dangerous had happened and everyone was safe. "Roof held," Gideon said, answering the question before she asked it. "Tarp bought it enough time. But they can't stay there tonight." "I made up the extra room," Marianne said. She looked at his hand. "Sit down." "It's nothing." "I know it's nothing. Sit down anyway." He sat down, which 3 months ago he would not have done. And she cleaned the cut with the carbolic and wrapped it with a strip of clean linen and was efficient about it because efficiency was the appropriate register for this kind of thing. His hand was large and rough-skinned, and she worked on it matter-of-factly and did not make it into more than it was. Though she was aware, in the way she was aware of most things now in his vicinity, of exactly what it was. "Thank you," he said when she was done. "Go change before you get the children sick," she said. He went. Nora appeared beside her at the counter. "He came out in that," Nora said in a low voice, nodding toward the storm-black window. "Didn't ask, just came." "He knew you needed it," Marianne said. Nora looked at her. 6 months ago, he didn't know what was happening 20 feet from his own front door. Marianne didn't say anything to that. "I'm just saying," Nora said. "Things are different." "Get your boys some stew," Marianne said. "They look hollow." Nora gave her one more look, the look that said, "I see what you're not saying and I will leave it alone for now," and went to her boys. Late that night, after the house was full of sleeping people and the storm had settled into a steady, tireless fall, Marianne stood in the dark kitchen with her hands wrapped around a cup of cooling coffee and looked at the rain against the window. She was running tallies in her head, the kind of tallies she'd been running since October started, since the conversations at the general store, since the parcels to the Prescotts, food supply across the valley, what was left, what was needed, what could still be salvaged if the weather gave them even 2 weeks of reasonable temperatures before real winter closed in. The numbers were not comfortable, but they were not hopeless. She'd been thinking about something Edna Carver had said during the preserving days, almost in passing, the way the most important things were often said. If we'd done this together in August, we'd have twice the yield. She'd said it not as a complaint, but as a fact, the way practical women stated things that were true and slightly too late to be useful. Marianne had been turning it over ever since. The problem with hard years was not, usually, that there wasn't enough. It was that what there was existed in the wrong places. One family had corn, but no wheat. Another had an intact roof, and 3 strong young men who could work but almost nothing in the cellar. The Harmons had a working smokehouse that nobody else in the immediate area had access to. The Hart Ranch had the deepest well in the valley, and she was only beginning to understand this, a particular position in the community's mental geography. It had been a center once, as Nora had said. It had a kind of authority that didn't come from wealth or power, but from having been the place where things were made and shared and decided. She was not Ruth Hart. She would not pretend to be. She'd been careful about that from the beginning. But she was here, and the house was still standing, and the table had extra chairs. She set her cup down and looked out at the rain and thought about what it would mean to use what was here, all of it, the well and the smokehouse access and the geographical position and the slowly rebuilding fact of the Hart name, to actually organize the valley's remaining resources against the winter. Not charity. Not the piecemeal kindness of parcels and preserving days, something more deliberate. She was still standing there when she heard footsteps on the stairs. She didn't turn. Gideon came into the kitchen and stopped when he saw her. "Can't sleep," he said. "No." He came to stand beside her at the window, a careful distance, looking at the rain. "I've been thinking," she said. "About what?" She told him. She told him about the tallies, which families had what, which had too little, which had resources that could be useful to others. She told him about Edna's comment and what she'd done with it in her head. She told him what she thought needed to happen before real winter arrived, which was a communal accounting. Not a meeting with speeches and voted resolutions, but a practical gathering, a working session, the kind of thing that produced inventory lists and agreements rather than sentiment. She told him that the Hart Ranch was the right place to hold it, and she told him why. He listened without interrupting, which she'd learned was his version of close attention. When she was done, he was quiet for a while. "That's not a small thing to organize," he said. "I know. People are proud. Prescott was hard enough, and that was just him and me. I know that too. You'd need to handle the women, and I'd need to handle the men, and we'd need to do it without it looking like what?" He turned and looked at her directly. "Like we think we know better than everyone else." "We don't think that," she said. "We just think winter's coming and everyone's short and working separately is stupider than working together." He held her gaze. "Yes," he said. "Yes, what?" "Yes, we'll do it." He paused. "When?" 2 weeks, she said, "before the first hard frost." He nodded. He looked back at the window. The rain ran in long lines down the glass. "Ruth would have done something like this," he said. Not sadly, or not only sadly, there was something in it that was closer to recognition. Marianne looked at the rain. "She left good instructions," she said. He was quiet. Then, "You read all of it?" "The recipes, yes. The margin notes especially." She paused. She had a very clear mind. "Yes," he said. "She did." And the way he said it had the particular tone of a man who was talking about loss and also, somehow, talking about something else at the same time. Something that was beginning to sit next to the loss rather than underneath it. Marianne did not look at him. "Go to sleep, Gideon," she said. "We have work in the morning." He went. She stayed by the window for another few minutes, watching the rain, and then she put her cup in the sink and went upstairs and lay in the dark and listened to the full house breathe around her. The sounds of people sleeping, of children and neighbors, and a man who was learning, slowly and painfully and imperfectly, that surviving was not the same as living. She had 2 weeks to pull a valley together. She'd worked with less. The gathering happened on a Saturday, 11 days after the October storm, which was as soon as Marianne could make it happen, and about 3 days later than she'd wanted. The delay came from the men. She'd expected resistance. Gideon had warned her, but she'd underestimated the particular texture of it. It wasn't hostility exactly. It was the resistance of people who had been managing their own trouble alone long enough that the idea of sitting down and laying it out in front of neighbors felt less like help and more like exposure. Tom Prescott said he'd come and then sent word the day before that he had fence work that couldn't wait, which they all understood meant he was afraid of what the accounting would reveal about his situation. One of the Dillard brothers, there were 2 of them ranching the land north of the Harmons, said flatly to Gideon that he didn't see the point of meetings when there was work to be done, and Gideon had to spend an entire afternoon riding out there to explain the point in language that didn't sound like a meeting. He came back from the Dillard place with mud on his boots and a look on his face that suggested the conversation had required more patience than he naturally possessed. They'll come, he said, standing in the kitchen doorway. Both of them? Younger one will. Older one said he'd think about it. He paused. Which means he'll come and pretend he decided at the last minute. Marianne nodded. And Prescott? I went there too. He pulled off his boots at the door, something he'd started doing about 3 weeks ago without her asking. Just a small domestic accommodation that had arrived and stayed. He'll come. He's just ashamed. He shouldn't be. I know he shouldn't be, Gideon said. That doesn't change the fact that he is. He was right about that, and she knew it, and she didn't push further. The women were easier and also harder in a different way. Easier because Nora and Edna Carver had already done the work of making the case. And the women of Red Hollow were practical in the way that women in hard places became practical. Not because they were stronger than the men, but because they were the ones who actually ran the calculations every day about what was in the cellar and what was on the table, and what the gap between those two things meant for the children who had to eat, regardless of anyone's pride. Harder, because once they agreed to come, they brought everything. Every worry, every piece of information, every fear about the winter that they'd been managing alone. The 2 afternoons Marianne spent visiting households in the week before the gathering were dense with information, and she wrote it down in the back of the ledger she'd bought at Carver's store and kept it organized because if she didn't keep it organized, it would become overwhelming, and overwhelming wasn't useful. Clara found her at the table one night, the ledger open in front of her, a pencil in her hand. "What are you doing?" Clara asked. Marianne turned the ledger so she could see. Inventory. Who has what? What the valley needs to get through February. Clara looked at the columns. She was quiet for a moment, reading. The Fitch family has almost nothing, she said. They lost the most, and there are 6 of them. They won't take help. Mr. Fitch is worse than Mr. Prescott. I know, Marianne said. I'm thinking about that. Clara pulled out a chair and sat down without being asked, which was something she did now with the ease of someone who had stopped calculating whether she was welcome. She looked at the numbers. If you put it as a trade, Clara said slowly, he might take it. Mr. Fitch is good with horses. Everybody knows that. If somebody needed horsework done in the spring, Marianne looked at her. Then it's not charity, Clara said. It's just forward payment. Marianne looked at the column next to the Fitch name. Then she made a note. That's a good idea, she said. Clara shrugged, in the way of people who had good ideas and weren't quite used to being told so. Mama used to do that with the Kellerman family. They had pride, too. She always found something they could do in return for something they needed. Marianne made another note. Your mother was practical. She called it being realistic about people, Clara said. She said most people wanted to be decent, but they needed it set up right, so they could be. Marianne put down the pencil and looked at the girl across the table. This girl who had Ruth's dark hair and Gideon's gray eyes, and something entirely her own in the way she moved through the world, something careful and observant and quietly fierce. She taught you a lot, Marianne said. She didn't have enough time, Clara said. It was not said with self-pity, just with the clear-eyed honesty of someone who had been sitting with that fact long enough that it didn't destroy her to say it out loud. No, Marianne agreed. She didn't. But what she did teach you, it shows. Clara looked at the ledger and said nothing. But she didn't leave the table either. She sat there while Marianne worked through 2 more columns, occasionally asking a question or making a quiet observation. And it was the most natural thing in the world, the 2 of them at the table in the lamplight. And Marianne kept her face neutral and her pencil moving and felt the specific weight of something she couldn't name pressing steadily against the inside of her chest. The Saturday gathering was held in the main room of the Hart House, which meant moving the furniture and borrowing 4 chairs from the Harmons and 1 from old Mr. Carver, who brought it himself and stayed, which no one had explicitly invited him to do, but no one turned him away either. 11 adults came. The 2 Dillard brothers, Tom Prescott, who arrived last and stood near the door for the first 20 minutes like a man keeping his options open, Nora Harmon, Edna Carver, 3 other women from households further out, a man named Walt Fisher, who ran the small mill at the edge of town, and a younger couple, the Reeds, who had come to Red Hollow just the previous spring and were therefore experiencing their first Kansas winter with the terrified determination of people who hadn't yet learned what they didn't know. Gideon opened it. He stood at the front of the room with his arms at his sides and said, without preamble, "We're here because the valley's short. Everyone knows it. We're not here to talk about blame or bad luck. We're here to figure out what we have and what we need and what we can do about the gap." He paused. "Marianne has numbers." He sat down. Several people looked at Marianne. She stood up. She had spent 2 days preparing what she said, and then spent one more day cutting it down to the most essential version of it, because she understood that the men in this room, the Prescotts and the Dillards and the Fitch, who had not come but whose situation she needed to address, would hear a long presentation as an imposition and a short one as respect. So she was short. She laid out the inventory, family by family, without naming shame or assigning fault, just presenting the column of numbers alongside the column of what a household needed to last to March. The gap, when she put it that way, was clear. And then she talked about what could close it. The Harmon Smokehouse, capable of handling meat from 3 households if they shared the labor. The Hart Well, already being shared with the Harmons, available to anyone who needed it through the winter. The mill, Walt Fisher had been running at half capacity because of the drought. But if families brought him what they had, and he processed it together in larger batches, the efficiency gain was significant. The Fitch situation, she didn't name it as charity. She named it as a trade, the horsework in spring, and she heard the slight shift in the room's energy when she did it, the way a solution that preserved dignity landed differently than one that didn't. She talked for 12 minutes. When she sat down, the room was quiet for a moment that felt longer than it was. Then Walt Fisher said, "The smokehouse plan makes sense. I'd want to know the schedule." And that was all it took. It wasn't smooth after that. Tom Prescott argued about the trade arrangement, not because he was against it, but because arguing was how he processed things. The older Dillard brother said something dismissive early on, and Nora Harmon cut him off with 3 words delivered so precisely that he didn't try again. There were 2 moments where the whole thing threatened to become a debate about old grievances that had nothing to do with winter food supplies. And both times Gideon stepped in with the flat, factual authority of a man who was not going to let the conversation go somewhere unproductive. And both times it worked. By the end of 2 hours, they had a plan. Not a perfect plan. A real one, with friction built into it, and personalities to manage, and at least 2 elements that Marianne privately thought might fall apart before January. But a plan that was better than what had existed before, which was 11 families each trying to outlast the winter alone. When people were filing out, Tom Prescott stopped near the door. He looked at Gideon. "Good thing," he said. That was all. Gideon nodded once. Prescott left. The older Dillard brother, on his way past, looked at Marianne with the expression of a man who had been unexpectedly shown something useful by someone he'd underestimated. "Good numbers," he said gruffly. "Thank you," she said. He left. Nora was the last to go, and she stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at Marianne with an expression that contained approximately everything she wasn't going to say. "Tuesday," Nora said. "First smokehouse day. I'll need you at 7. "I'll be there at 6:45, Marianne said. Nora squeezed her hand once, briefly, and went. The house went quiet. Ben was already in bed. He'd been put up early, with protests because the gathering required adult space. Clara was upstairs. Marianne stood in the front room that still had the borrowed chairs in it and the particular atmosphere of a space where something had happened. And she felt the specific exhaustion of the kind of work that ran on nerve and attention rather than muscle. She heard Gideon behind her. "You need to sit down," he said. "I'm fine. You've been on your feet since 5 this morning." She turned around. He was standing in the middle of the room with a look on his face that she'd been seeing more of lately. The one that was trying to be just practical and wasn't quite succeeding. "I'll help you move the chairs back tomorrow," she said. "I'll do the chairs," he said. "Sit down, Marianne." She sat down. He brought her a cup of coffee, not asked for, just brought, and sat in the chair across from her, and for a while neither of them said anything. The fire had burned low and the room had the amber, settling quality of a late evening in a house where the work was done. "It went well," he said. "Parts of it. The important parts." She held the cup with both hands and let the warmth into her palms. "Prescott will be the weak link." He agreed, but he's still ashamed of his situation. He might pull back when it comes to actually doing the smokehouse. "I'll talk to him." "Don't make it about pity." "I know not to make it about pity," he said, with a slight edge that wasn't quite irritation. It was the edge of someone who felt he'd earned enough credit by now to be trusted on a basic point. She looked at him. "I know you do," she said. "I'm just thinking out loud." He looked at the fire. "That's what Ruth used to do," he said. "Think out loud. I'd forget sometimes that she wasn't asking me to fix anything. She was just working it through." Marianne was quiet. "I used to interrupt," he said. "Tell her what I thought she should do about whatever she was thinking about. She hated that." Something almost like a rueful expression moved across his face. "She told me once that the most useless thing a person could do was offer solutions to problems that hadn't finished being described yet." "She was right," Marianne said. "I know she was." He paused. "I'm better at it now, listening." He looked at her. "She'd probably find that funny, that I learned it after." The fire popped. Outside, the wind moved through something. A loose board on the barn, or the fence, with a low, rhythmic sound. "Gideon," Marianne said. "What?" She'd been carrying something for weeks now. Not a question exactly, more a shape in the air between them that she'd been careful not to press against directly. But the room was quiet and the house was still, and she was tired in a way that made carefulness feel like more effort than honesty. "What did you mean," she said, "that night on the wagon, when you said it wasn't only grief?" He was very still. She waited. He looked at the fire for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was even, but it had the quality of something being moved that hadn't moved in a while. "Before Ruth died," he said. "When we knew. When the doctor had been, and we understood what was happening." He paused. "She asked me to promise her something." Marianne didn't speak. "She asked me to promise I'd keep the children safe, keep the ranch, keep going." He pressed his hands together, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. "She made me say it out loud. She was very specific about it. She wanted to hear the words." "And you promised?" "Yes." His jaw tightened. "And then she died in March, and by April Ben had lost 8 pounds, and Clara had stopped talking, and I hadn't planted the south field, and the roof over the kitchen was leaking, and He stopped. He was quiet for so long that Marianne thought he might not continue. "I had promised her," he said. "I had said the words, and I couldn't do it. I couldn't do the one thing she needed me to do." His voice had not broken. It was still flat, still controlled. But underneath the control was something so worn down, it had gone past the point of sounding like pain and into something quieter and worse. Every day I looked at those children and I thought, I told her I would. I told her. And I'm failing them every single day. Marianne set down her cup. "Is that why you put the notice out?" she said carefully. He looked at her. "Because you couldn't do it yourself and you couldn't admit that, so you hired someone else to do what you'd promised?" It was a hard thing to say. She watched it land. His jaw worked. "That's one way to put it. Is it wrong?" A long pause. "No," he said. "It's not wrong." Marianne leaned forward. Not to touch him, she didn't do that, just to close the distance slightly. "Listen to me," she said. "Clara is cooking. She asked me to stay. Ben told me 3 days ago that this is his favorite winter, which is the most heartbreaking and hopeful thing I've ever heard a child say. Your well is keeping 3 households going. Your table just held 11 people who made a plan that might get this valley through to spring." She paused. "What does failing look like, Gideon? Because I'm looking at this house and I'm not seeing it." He looked at her. The gray eyes were not flat. They hadn't been flat for weeks, she realized. She'd just stopped registering the change because it had happened so gradually. "I didn't do those things," he said. "You did." "I did some of them," she said. "You did others. The children did some. Nora, Edna, everyone in this valley who showed up today." She kept her voice level. "When you made that promise to Ruth, she wasn't asking you to do it alone. She was asking you to make sure it got done." He stared at her. "It's getting done," she said. The fire had gone to embers. The wind outside had settled. Gideon put his face in his hands. Not dramatically, not weeping, just the gesture of a man releasing something that had been held at great cost for a very long time. He sat that way for maybe 30 seconds. Then he took his hands down and looked at the ceiling and exhaled. He didn't say anything. She didn't ask him to. After a while, he stood up, and picked up both cups and took them to the kitchen, and she heard him at the pump, and then his footsteps on the stairs, slow and deliberate, going up. She sat alone in the ember-lit room for a while. She wasn't sure what she felt. She wasn't sure she was going to let herself find out yet. There was still so much work to do, and she had learned over the years that the surest way to ruin something growing was to examine it too closely before it had the strength to hold up to examination. She banked the fire and went upstairs. The following weeks had a different quality than anything that had come before them. Not easier exactly, but cleaner, more honest. The kind of days that came after something that had needed to be said finally got said, even imperfectly, even incompletely. The smokehouse arrangement started on the Tuesday Nora had specified. It was cold, dirty, difficult work that required more coordination than the plan had accounted for, and produced at least one heated argument between Nora and the older Dillard brother about the proper temperature for a curing fire, which Marianne stayed out of, on the grounds that Nora was right and would win without her assistance. She was right. She won. The Fitch arrangement, the horsework trade, came together in a way that suggested Clara had been exactly correct about the approach. When Gideon had ridden out to the Fitch place and proposed it, he'd framed it as the ranch needing help come spring, which was true and also generous enough in its framing that Howard Fitch could accept it without feeling managed. He'd come to the smokehouse day the following week, worked all morning without speaking much, and left with his share of the meat without making it into anything more than a transaction, which meant it would likely happen again. Tom Prescott did pull back slightly, as Marianne had predicted. He skipped the second coordination meeting with some excuse about the weather. Gideon rode out and talked to him, and she didn't ask what was said, and Prescott showed up at the third meeting and was, if not transformed, at least present and functional. Clara and Dottie Prescott began talking again. Marianne noticed it first from the kitchen window. Dottie had come by on some errand her mother had invented, probably, and Clara had come out onto the porch, and the two of them had stood there for a while in the careful way of girls who had been separated by circumstances neither of them controlled and weren't quite sure how to get back to where they'd been. She watched them from the window and didn't go outside. After maybe 10 minutes, she saw Clara say something and gesture toward the barn, and the two girls disappeared around the corner, and that was that. She went back to what she was doing. When Clara came in for supper that evening, she said, without preamble, "Dottie wants to know if she can come for the smokehouse day on Saturday." "Tell her to ask her mother," Marianne said. "But I don't see why not." Clara nodded, started to leave, stopped. "Marianne?" She turned. Clara was standing in the kitchen doorway with one hand on the frame and the gray eyes that looked like her father's but had something in them that was entirely her own. "I know you're going to stay," Clara said. Marianne looked at her steadily. "You don't have to say anything about it," Clara said. "I just wanted you to know that I know." She paused. "And that it's—" The chin came up slightly. "It's all right. With me." Marianne stood very still. "I mean, I want you to," Clara said, with the slightly strangled tone of someone forcing themselves to say a thing completely. "I'm not just saying it's all right like I'm being polite. I actually want you to stay." The chin came up another fraction of an inch, as if bracing for something. "I thought you should know that." Marianne crossed the kitchen and put her hand on Clara's shoulder. Brief, firm, the kind of touch that said, "I hear you," without making it into a scene. "Thank you," she said. "That means a great deal to me." Clara nodded briskly, in the way of someone who had completed a difficult task and was moving on. She went upstairs. Marianne stood in the kitchen for a moment with her hand still slightly raised, as if it hadn't gotten the message that it was done. Then she went back to supper. The evening it happened, the evening Gideon said what he said, was unremarkable up to that point. A Wednesday in early November, with the first real freeze settled in and the ground outside hard and pale. Supper had been eaten. Ben had been sent up to bed after a prolonged argument about whether or not he needed to wash before sleeping, which he had lost on the grounds that Marianne would not negotiate on this point. Clara had gone up voluntarily an hour later, which she was doing more often now. Choosing sleep, choosing rest, a body slowly remembering that it didn't have to be on guard all the time. Marianne was in the kitchen cleaning up. Gideon came in and leaned against the counter, not quite in her way, and watched her work in the manner she'd come to recognize as him being present without knowing exactly what to do with the presence. "Clara talked to you," he said. It wasn't a question. She told me she wanted me to stay, Marianne said. She kept her hands in the wash water. I know, she told me she'd talk to you. He paused. She said she wanted to say it herself before I did. Marianne was very still. Before you did, she repeated. She's protective, he said. She thought... He stopped. She thought it would mean more coming from her, because she was the one who made it hardest. Marianne pulled her hands out of the water and dried them on the cloth hanging from the oven rail and turned around. Gideon was looking at her with an expression that had shed most of its usual careful distance. Not gone entirely, because he was who he was, and some things took time, but far enough gone that she could see the thing underneath it clearly. I'm not good at this, he said. I know, she said. I'm going to say it badly. Probably, she said. He almost smiled. The almost smile had become, over the months, one of her most reliable coordinates. She could measure how things stood by how close it got to actually arriving. I don't want you to stay because of the children, he said. I mean, I want that. The children need you, but that's not what I'm saying. He paused. He had his hands at his sides and he was standing very straight in the way he stood when he was working at something difficult. I want you to stay because He stopped again. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he'd changed his mind. I want you to stay because this house is different when you're in it, he said finally. Not because you cook or because you manage things, though you do both, but because when I come in at the end of the day, I think about... He stopped, started over. There's a difference between a house that's running and a house that has someone in it who you want to come home to. I forgot that difference existed. He looked at her directly. I don't want to forget it again. The kitchen was quiet. Outside the window, the frozen ground held the moonlight in a thin silver sheen. Marianne looked at this man, at the lines around his eyes that grief had put there, at the rough, careful hands, at the jaw that was set even now out of habit, and she felt the things she'd been not examining for months rise up with the patience of something that had been waiting and was done waiting. I came here with a letter in a worn-out bag, she said. I had no intention of... She stopped. Tried again. I was careful. I was careful because I know what happens when a woman in my situation isn't careful. I know, he said. I'm still careful, she said. About some things. I know that too. She looked at him for a long moment. Ask me to stay, she said. Not because the children need it. Not because the house needs it. Ask me for yourself. He held her gaze without flinching. Stay, he said. Marianne, stay. The fire in the stove made its small sounds. The house settled around them the way old houses did, the slow conversation of timber and cold. All right, she said. It was not the end of the hard things. She knew that. She'd always known that, from the moment she walked up that lane with her bag on her shoulder and saw the house with its peeling paint and its missing shutter and the child's boot by the fence post. Life in Red Hollow was not going to become simple or painless because two people had said honest things to each other in a kitchen on a Wednesday night in November. But she had said yes, and she had meant it. And somewhere upstairs, Clara was asleep, and Ben was asleep, and the smokehouse was full of meat enough to last the valley to spring, and the table had extra chairs, and outside the frozen ground was holding the moonlight, and it was enough. For now, it was entirely enough. Winter came down hard on Red Hollow in December, the way Kansas winters did, without apology and without much warning beyond what the animals already knew. The ground froze solid by the second week. The creek stopped moving. The mornings were the kind of dark and cold that made getting out of bed feel like a small act of courage, and the evenings came so early that by 4 o'clock the light was already going amber and thin across the fields. But the valley did not break. It bent. Some days it bent considerably, but it held. The smokehouse arrangement ran through November and into December, and the meat it produced was distributed by a system that Marianne and Nora had worked out on paper and adjusted twice when reality proved more complicated than the plan. The Harmon boys hauled wood. The Dillard brothers, once they had committed to a thing, turned out to be the most reliable workers in the valley. They showed up when they said they would, and they didn't complain, and they didn't need managing, which was more than could be said for everyone. Walt Fisher ran the mill through 3 large communal batches and charged less than he could have, which was his own quiet way of participating in something he hadn't been asked to lead but understood the value of. Howard Fitch showed up in December with a horse that needed shoeing and two that needed their teeth floated, and he did the work without being asked twice and ate the lunch Marianne put out and went home without making a thing of it. His wife, a thin woman named Agnes, whom Marianne had met only briefly at the gathering, sent back a jar of something preserved. She wasn't sure what, the label was smudged, and a note that said simply, "Thank you for the winter." 3 words. Marianne kept the note in the back of the ledger. Tom Prescott remained Tom Prescott. He participated when he participated and pulled back when something in him needed to pull back. And Gideon rode out there every 2 or 3 weeks on no particular pretext and stayed an hour and came back without reporting much about what was said. Whatever those conversations were, they held Prescott in the arrangement through January, which was the critical month, the month when the Valley's stores were lowest and the winter still had weeks left in it. Marianne did not manage all of this alone, and she was careful not to let anyone believe she did. She was the one who kept the ledger and tracked the inventory and noticed when something was about to go wrong before it went wrong. But that was a specific kind of work, the background arithmetic of collective survival. And it was not the same as the work Gideon did, or Nora, or the women who showed up to the smokehouse days in the cold and worked until their hands ached. She'd learned, somewhere in Ohio or Missouri, that the people who thought they were holding everything together were usually just the ones who could see all the pieces. The actual holding was distributed. It was in every person who showed up when they said they would. She tried to remember that on the days when the ledger numbers were close and the weather was bad, and she was tired in a way that went past her body. There were several such days in January. The hardest one was a Thursday, when the temperature dropped to something that didn't have a name in polite conversation, and the wind came from the northwest with a purpose. And Marianne stood at the kitchen window before dawn and looked at the dark and thought, with a clarity that surprised her, that she had no idea if any of this was going to work. Not the smokehouse plan, not the valley, not the thing between her and Gideon that had been named in the kitchen in November and had existed since then in the careful, slightly tentative way of something that had been brought into the light before it was entirely ready for it. All of it. She stood at the window, and she was not certain about any of it. She lit the stove anyway. That was the thing about uncertainty. It didn't change what the morning required. The fire needed lighting, the children needed feeding, the animals needed tending, the ledger needed updating. Uncertainty was a feeling, not a fact, and feelings didn't get a vote on whether the work got done. She'd learned this early, in the years before Red Hollow. In the harder years, she didn't talk about much. She had come to think of it not as strength exactly, but as a kind of stubbornness. You kept going, not because you were sure it would work out, but because stopping was its own kind of answer, and she'd never been willing to give it. Gideon came downstairs an hour later and found her at the stove. He looked at her face and said, What's wrong?" "Nothing." "Marianne." She turned around. He was standing in the kitchen in his work clothes, his hair not yet sorted, looking at her with the directness he'd been using more since November. The directness of a man who had decided that not seeing things clearly was a luxury he couldn't afford anymore. "I don't know if the Fitch family has enough to last the month," she said. "I've run the numbers 4 times. He was quiet. "And the Prescott cow went dry," she said, "which means their milk situation is—" "I know about the cow," he said. "I'll ride out today." "In this weather?" "It's not that bad." "It is that bad." "Then it's that bad, and I'll still ride out." He came and stood beside her at the stove. He wasn't touching her. They were still careful with each other in the kitchen, in the daylight, with children who might come downstairs. But he was close enough that she felt the warmth of him. "You're allowed to be worried," he said. "You don't have to fix it in your head before breakfast." She looked at him. "I know," she said, which was what she said when something was true and she was working on believing it. He rode out in the bad weather. He came back 4 hours later with the particular look of a man who had done what needed doing and was cold to the bone about it. He'd made an arrangement with the Fitches about their cow. She didn't ask the details, and he didn't offer them, just said it was handled. And he'd stopped at the Prescotts and done something there too that Tom Prescott would probably not fully acknowledge for another 6 weeks. That night, he sat at the dinner table and ate the soup she'd made and listened to Ben describe in elaborate detail a battle he'd been conducting in the barn between 2 field mice and an imaginary cavalry. And his face had the expression she'd been watching arrive since September, the expression of a man who was present. not managing from a distance, not surviving the meal until he could be alone again. Actually there, at his own table, in his own life. Ben finished his battle narrative and looked at his father expectantly. "Which side won?" Gideon asked. "The mice," Ben said. "They usually do," Gideon said. Clara looked up from her bowl and caught Marianne's eye across the table, and something passed between them that didn't need words. The small, quiet recognition of two people who had watched something come back from far away, and were not going to make a fuss about it because making a fuss would only frighten it off. February arrived and the valley's food held. Not comfortably. Not without days when the arithmetic was frightening. But it held, because 11 families had made agreements and mostly kept them, and because the Harmon Smokehouse had worked, and because Walt Fisher's mill batches had stretched the grain further than anyone had managed alone. And because Marianne's ledger had caught 3 situations before they became crises, and Gideon had ridden out in bad weather more times than she'd counted. It held because it was not any one thing. That was the part she kept coming back to, in the quiet moments of February when the worst seemed to be passing. It was not any single heroic act. It was dozens of ordinary acts done consistently by people who were tired and proud and sometimes difficult and had chosen, anyway, to show up. The first genuinely warm day came in early March. Not spring, not yet, but the first day when the cold had a different quality to it, the kind that retreated in the afternoon and let the sun do something real. Marianne was in the garden, turning over the frozen solid earth that wasn't quite ready to be turned but needed the attention anyway, when she heard the gate. She turned. Clara was coming across the yard with her coat open and Dottie Prescott beside her, the two of them talking with the ease of girls who had found their way back to each other. Behind them, at a slight distance, Ben was running in the purposeless, full-speed way of 7-year-old boys in the first warmth of the year, going nowhere specific at considerable speed. Marianne stood with her spade and watched them cross the yard. She thought about a morning in July. It felt like a different life, though it was only 8 months ago. Standing at the kitchen window of a house that smelled like closed rooms and unmade meals, looking at a child's single boot by the fence post. She thought about the flat-eyed man in the doorway and the 2 thin children on the stairs. She thought about Ruth Hart's recipe book and the clear, practical handwriting of a woman who had known she was dying and used her remaining time to make sure her family would still be fed. The boot was still there, she realized. She'd kept meaning to move it and kept not doing it, and at some point she'd stopped thinking of it as something to deal with and started thinking of it as just part of the yard. Ruth's yard. The yard that was also now hers. She went back to turning the soil. The marriage question was raised, as it happened, not by Gideon, but by Ben. He came to her one afternoon in March while she was at the kitchen table with the ledger that was getting thinner with entries now, the valley's worst behind it, and he stood beside her with the look of someone who had been composing a speech. "Marianne," he said. "Ben." "If you married Papa," he said, "would that make you our mother?" She put down her pencil. She looked at him. This boy who had grown, she thought, an inch since July, who was 7 now, with the same dark, serious eyes, and the same tendency to ask questions that adults were still trying to answer. "That's a big question," she said. "I know," he said. "I've been thinking about it for a while." "What made you think about it?" He considered. "Dottie said her mother said you and Papa were going to get married, and I wanted to know what that would mean." He paused. "For me and Clara." Marianne folded her hands on the table. "It would mean I'd be your stepmother," she said honestly. "Which is different from a mother. Your mother was Ruth. That doesn't change." Ben thought about this with the thoroughness he applied to most things. "But you'd be here," he said, "all the time, not just because of the letter." "Yes," she said. "I'd be here because I chose to be, because I want to be." "That's what I thought," Ben said, with the satisfaction of someone whose hypothesis had been confirmed. "I think that's better, actually, if you choose it." He went back outside. Marianne sat at the table for a moment and then picked up her pencil and went back to the ledger. But her hand was not quite steady, and she had to wait a minute before the numbers made sense. Gideon asked her on a Sunday in late March. Not with ceremony. She wouldn't have wanted ceremony, and he wasn't the kind of man who did things with ceremony. They were on the porch in the late afternoon sun, the first real warmth of the season, sitting in the 2 chairs that had somehow migrated from the kitchen to the porch sometime in February and had not migrated back. The yard was still winter pale, but there was something in the air that had changed, some quality of the light that said the ground was thinking about thawing. He said, "I want to ask you something." She said, "I know." He looked at her. "Ben told you." "Ben didn't tell me anything. She paused. "I know you." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the yard. Then he looked at her. "I can't promise it'll be easy," he said. "This place, these children, Claire has years of hard ahead of her still, and Ben is—" He stopped. "I'm not an easy man." "I know that," she said. "I'm better than I was," he said, "but I'm not. I'm still going to get it wrong sometimes. I'm going to go quiet when I should talk and go too far when I should stay back and—" "Gideon," she said. He stopped. "I'm not easy either," she said. "I have habits from years of managing alone that are going to drive you to distraction. I'm going to run numbers in my head when you're trying to talk to me. I'm going to solve problems before you finish describing them, and I know you hate that." He made a sound that was halfway to a laugh. It arrived this time, actually arrived, the real thing, brief and rough and entirely unperformed, and she felt it somewhere in her chest like a door opening. "Yes or no," he said when the moment had passed. "That's all I need." She looked at the yard, at the pale winter ground that was getting ready, slowly, to become something else. At the fence post where the child's boot had sat since before she'd arrived and was sitting still. She would move it this spring. She'd made her peace with it being there through the winter, but spring was the right time. Not to forget it, but to put it somewhere it could be kept properly. Inside, maybe. On the shelf in the hallway where the photographs were. A different kind of keeping. "Yes," she said. He reached over and put his hand over hers on the armrest. Not a romantic gesture, just a solid, real, deliberate contact between two people who had earned each other through a very long and difficult fall and winter. And they sat that way for a while in the first real warmth of the year. The wedding was in April. It was not a large affair. Nora and her boys came. The Prescotts came, which meant something. Old Mr. Carver came and stood in the back and said nothing, but was clearly moved by something, though he would have denied it under oath. Edna Fisher. She and Walt had been keeping company since February, which was information that had arrived in the valley with the quiet certainty of things that had been inevitable for a while, brought a cake that was the best thing Marianne had eaten since arriving in Kansas, and she said so, and Edna looked pleased in the controlled way of women who had worked hard at something and knew it had come out right. Clara stood beside Marianne through the ceremony with her back straight and her chin at the particular angle it had when she was managing a feeling that was larger than she had words for. Afterward, when the adults were talking and Ben was underfoot being Ben, Clara came and stood beside Marianne at the edge of the yard. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "She would have liked you." Marianne looked at her. Mama, Clara said. She would have approved." She said the word with some difficulty, as if she'd been working up to it. She was particular about people. She didn't like everyone. A pause. She liked people who meant what they said. Marianne put an arm around the girl's shoulders briefly, and Clara allowed it in the way she was beginning to allow things. Not leaning in exactly, not resisting either, just being present. "That means a great deal," Marianne said. "I know," Clara said. "That's why I said it." She moved off to find Dottie, and Marianne stood at the edge of the yard and watched the people in it. Gideon listening to Tom Prescott with the patient look he'd developed, Ben explaining something to one of the Harmon boys with the urgency of someone whose information cannot wait, Nora catching her eye across the yard and raising a cup in a small private toast that said everything it needed to say. The valley came back that spring. The way things came back after hard years. Not all at once, not uniformly, not without damage still visible in the places where the drought had gone deepest. Some of what had been lost stayed lost. 2 families didn't return. The Grubers sent a letter from up north saying they'd put roots down in Nebraska and weren't coming back. And Marianne read the letter and felt something for them that wasn't quite grief, but was adjacent to it. The particular feeling for people who had tried and found their limit and had to make peace with what that meant. But the families who had stayed were different in some way she found hard to articulate. They'd been tested in a specific way, together, and they hadn't all passed perfectly, but they'd passed, and that knowledge changed something in the texture of daily life. The easiness between households. The way people helped each other now, without requiring the help to be dressed up as something else first. The Hart Ranch was, as Nora had predicted, a center again. Marianne didn't think about it in those terms. She thought about it in terms of the table. Who was sitting at it? On what days? For what reasons? By May, it was not unusual for the table to hold 8 people on a given evening, some combination of neighbors and children and the occasional traveler who'd been pointed there by someone in town. She cooked, and Gideon sat at the head of it, and Clara held court with Dottie Prescott, and Ben talked to everyone with equal intensity. And it was not the house she'd walked into in July. It was not better in a simple way. It was complicated in the way that living things were complicated. Clara still had hard days, days when she went quiet and Marianne left her alone and later found her sitting on the floor of the upstairs hall near the door to the room that had been Ruth's, just sitting. And those days happened less often, but they still happened. Gideon still went too quiet sometimes when something was wrong, still had to be drawn out rather than met, still occasionally made decisions alone that should have been made together and acknowledged it only afterward with a look that said, "I know," and meant, "I'm working on it." Marianne still ran numbers in her head at the wrong moments, still found it hard to ask for things, still had days when she reached for the detachment she'd carried for years like a tool, and found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she didn't need it as much anymore and wasn't sure what to do with her hands. You didn't heal from a hard year the way a bone healed, clean and complete and stronger at the break. You carried it differently. You learned, slowly, what to put down and what to keep. One evening in June, a year almost to the month from when Marianne had stepped off the train, she was sitting on the porch steps in the long light of early summer when Ben came and sat beside her. He was 7.5 now, which he considered significantly different from 7. He had Ruth's book of pressed flowers that Clara had found in the bedroom and given him because he had a naturalist interest in things that grew, and he was going through it with the focused attention he gave to anything he truly loved. He pointed to a pressed flower near the back of the book, a wild prairie aster, pale purple. "Do you know what this one is?" he asked. She looked at it. "Prairie aster," she said. "They come up in fall. After hard summers, sometimes they're the first thing." Ben looked at the flower for a long moment. "Mama put it in here," he said. Not sadly, just as a fact about the world. "She did," Marianne said. He closed the book and held it on his lap and leaned, very slightly, against her arm in the way he did sometimes without seeming to notice he was doing it. The yard was warm. The fence was fixed, had been fixed since March, all of it, every post and wire line. The garden was coming in green and actual this year, not the desperate stripped-down version of last summer, but a real garden, with more in it than there would be mouths to eat. The well was full. The barn roof was solid. The split oak tree at the end of the lane was putting out leaves in the extravagant way it did in good years, the kind of growth that looked like a living thing that had decided to make a point. Marianne sat on the porch, with Ben leaning against her arm, and Ruth's book of flowers between them, and she thought about the woman on the train in July, the woman with the worn canvas bag and the letter and the specific kind of tired that came from moving through the world mostly alone. She had not come to Red Hollow expecting anything except work. She had not come expecting a man to see her, or children to claim her, or a community to organize itself around a table she was feeding. She had not come expecting to stay. But here was the thing she'd learned in this place, in this hard and particular year. The life you made deliberately, out of necessity and stubbornness and the daily choice to show up. That life turned out to matter in ways the life you planned for never quite did. You could not plan for a child handing you a recipe book. You could not plan for 2 people sitting in the dark listening to rain and saying true things to each other. You could not plan for a valley that held. You could only keep going when it was hard and pay attention when it mattered, and not walk away when walking away would have been easier. She had not walked away. Ben turned another page of the flower book, studying something small and yellow with total concentration. Inside the house, she could hear Clara moving around in the kitchen, and the sound of Gideon's boots on the stairs, and the familiar knock of the loose board on the second step that nobody had gotten around to fixing and that she'd started to think of as the house's voice. The sound of a place that was occupied, that was lived in, that had people in it who came home. The evening light went long and gold across the yard. She stayed on the porch until the stars came out.